Sure, I mean, he was born in 1768 in the city of Bern to Gottlieb Emanuel von Haller, who served as a counselor in the Grand Council of Bern as well as a bailiff. His mother was a member of a hot bourgeois family, von Schultjes. And the name itself is actually interesting because in Bern, the government was known by the title of Schultjes und Rat der Stadt Bern, meaning literally the mayor and council of the city of Bern, which Haller at one point actually he criticizes the use of the term republic, Respublika, public thing, because it erases the corporate rights of the free city in favor of an imaginary idea of a civil society. Interestingly enough, Bern, despite being an independent city-state since at least the 14th century, they did not call themselves a republic until 1716. Prior to that, the name was the City and Community of Bern, not a republic, but a Bürgergemeinde, like a civic community. And the actual locus of sovereignty in a traditional republic is the corporation itself, and the corporation as assembled in a council. It's not the territory. The territory has nothing to do with it. The territory is a possession of the corporation, and as well as the subjects who live under its jurisdiction, but the actual locus of sovereignty is the corporation itself. When it goes extinct, so does the state. Either way, he's a Bernese patrician. The name, the nobiliary particle von in his name is not an actual title of nobility, by the way. Sometime in the 1750s, the Council of Bern authorized its citizens to use the particle von so as to, impress foreign diplomats, but it never was a true title of nobility. In fact, Haller would argue that nobility, properly speaking, is antithetical to a republic. Republics can have like distinctions between old citizens and new citizens, those who have like a long history of service in their families, who have a certain like distinction of honor, primus inter pares, first among equals, but there can never be a true patriciate in republics. Either way, from a very early age, like at the age of 16, he starts volunteering in the Bernese State Chancellery, and he goes through a whole bunch of positions. His grandfather was the famous polymath Albrecht von Haller, who made the various contributions to physiology and anatomy. His grandfather dies when he's young. He receives an inheritance. His father, Gottlieb Emanuel von Haller, also dies, I think, sometime in 1784. And Haller, despite being a minor, becomes the de facto guardian of in 1786, his father died, so Haller would be 18. In fact, his father's estate was given to a guardian, but Haller ended up controlling it de facto. Like his father had like a vast library, which he donated to the city. Already, by the time Haller was like 17, 18, he was already he wasn't yet a counselor, but he did like spectate on council meetings. Like you can find letters that he writes to his grandfather about, for example, mercenary costs in Geneva, the use of judicial torture, and so forth. At the age of 20, he becomes a Kommissionsschreiber, a commission's clerk, where he is responsible for supervising judicial penalties in the criminal commission. At the time, there was no like criminal code or no penal code. Like judges, basically, they gave penalties at their own discretion. He writes about this in his memoirs, about how this early experience of governing led to his eventual antipathy towards this, the mania of fabricating codes, as he called it. He was raised a Protestant, of course. I mean, Bern was a Protestant state. He was taught in the Heidelberg Catechism of Calvinism. But already, even as a young man, he went to Lucerne and Fribourg, these Catholic cities, where at the age of 14, he saw the the Friday fast in Catholicism for the first time, and he remembers being very captivated by it. He had no clue at the time that he would convert to Catholicism himself in 1820. That is exactly what happened. Either way, what happens is that, in 1789, he's now 21. And of course, the French Revolution starts to emerge, initially on a fairly moderate course, but very quickly radicalizing. And he says himself in his own words that in 1789, up until then, I had never crossed the borders of Switzerland, had never been to a university. I was completely unaware as to the existence and the goings on of the secret societies, about the so-called Enlightenment prevailing at the time, which was trumpeted in all books. He does, however, at one point start reading C.S. and his essay on privileges, and he's captivated by what he calls his masculine prose, but is quickly disillusioned from it. He starts investing in a French annuity plan, but in 1790, when the French government, the National Convention or the National Assembly at the time, I think still, they start nationalizing church properties as biens nationaux, national goods. They start, inflating the paper currency. He manages to sell it off in time before it collapses. He also recounts a very interesting anecdote. I'd like to quote it. This is around, again, late 1789. During the autumn vacation, I made a short trip on foot, mostly via Basel and Schaffhausen, to see my grandfather in Zurich. One night there at my maternal uncle's home, a good-natured trader from Zurich, from a good family, spoke with such enthusiasm about the French Revolution, announcing that milk and honey would flow, even that we would return to the Golden Age. The guests listened to the prophecy with amazement, but without lending it firm faith. No one knew that instead of milk and honey, rivers of blood and tears would flow, and almost all of Europe would be covered in burnt and slain corpses. Only incurable discord would be introduced, and the whole of human society would be torn from its joints. If that's not poetry, I don't know what is. In 1790, he starts accumulating more posts. He becomes in charge of the state grain chambers, which collect grain types from the peasants and redistribute as like a dole. He actually goes to Paris. On July 14th, 1790, he's at the Fête de la Fédération, where he witnesses the king not only celebrating the mass, but for the first time taking the oath to the Constitution. And he notes at the time that how uncomfortable this made him feel to notice like the principles of the old and the new side by side so starkly. So in 1791, of course, Louis XVI makes the flight to Varennes. The Baron is about to host its 600-year jubilee in 1791, but the Daily Council decides to suspend it because it might provoke and exasperate hostile passions. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? So they celebrated at a private banquet. In 1792, things start getting very serious. France and Austria are now at war. The September massacres in Paris break out. The Swiss guards get slaughtered. The territory of the Vaud, which is in western Switzerland in the French-speaking part known as Romandy, which Bern had conquered in 1536 during one of the Italian wars and administered as a bailiwick. There started being anti-Bernese uprisings, which were provoked by the French. In fact, ultimately, Switzerland would be invaded by France in 1798, and this was done with the explicit collusion of many Vaudois politicians like Peter Ox and Frédéric Le Harpe, both whom were Freemasons, whom Haller, of course, never forgave. So basically, the entire 1790s in Bernese politics is just a constant struggle for the not just Bern, but the Swiss Confederation as a whole to exercise its neutrality against an increasingly belligerent French state. And there's all sorts of diplomatic missions which I'm I will talk about in my commentary, so I'm going to be brief here. I will say, however, that Haller did at one point, he met with Napoleon himself in Lugano. This would have been in like 1797, as well as Talleyrand and Madame du Stal. So, he had by the time he was like 30 years old, he had already had like 14 years of political experience. This man he wasn't like just some like scribbler or philosopher. Like everything he wrote later on was all on not just abstract philosophy, but all like from his own like practical experience, his own blood and sweat. But in 1798, in March 1798, he attempts to make one last compromise with the French authorities by penning a constitutional project for Bern. But this fails, and I think on March the 5th, 1798, Bern falls, and the Swiss Confederation is abolished in favor of the Helvetic Republic, a unitary Jacobin state. And it's at this point that Haller becomes a committed counter-revolutionary. He starts publishing the Helvetische Annalen, the premier like anti-French, anti-revolutionary newspaper, which goes through 61 issues, but is eventually shut down and he's proscribed. So he ends up fleeing to the city of Rastatt, which I think was in Germany, I believe. Yeah, in Württemberg. From that point on, he ends up joining the one of the Austrian armies with Archduke Charles, the Duke of Teschen. This is around April or May of 1799. The army enters Switzerland through like the northeast, through Schaffhausen. He joins them up there, and he becomes a servant in the Austrian War Council, the Reichskriegskanzlei, from 1799 to 1806. In the meantime, in 1803, the Helvetic Republic starts to be eventually the more outright Jacobinical elements start becoming moderated. Some semblance of cantonal sovereignty is restored, although still under French control. And in 1806, he leaves Vienna and returns to Bern, where he's hired as a professor of constitutional law at a Bernese academy. It did not yet become the University of Bern until 1834. At that point, it was only just a private academy. Either way, he returns, he becomes a professor, he marries a woman from a Bernese patrician lineage, Katharina von Wattenwyl, and he has 3 children who were born in the subsequent 3 years. And it's in 1806 that he starts his restoration of political science. I mean, already there's letters to like his confidants where he already starts charting out the initial ideas. His first major contribution would be the Über die Notwendigkeit einer anderen obersten Begründung des allgemeinen Staatsrechts, on the necessity of another supreme ground for general constitutional law. This was a lecture of about 75 pages long, which already the fundamentals of his patrimonial doctrine were already there. He would write 2 more subsequent essays in 1807. One is about on natural superiority as the foundation of political authority, and the other one was the acquired rights of a prince deriving from his proprietary interest in land, his domains and regalia, as they're called. His first major publication of his doctrine is, of course, the Handbuch der Allgemeinen Staatenkunde, the Handbook of General Politics, in 1808, at 300 pages long, where basically this was already all of the core principles of what would become the restoration of political science were already there. In fact, I'm going to quote from a letter in which he wrote to Johann von Müller, who's the brother of a major Swiss historian. Shortly after, he asked his advice on this book, the Handbook of 1808, and here we have a few notes. I regret only not having indicated and developed three things. One, the sentence in page 61 that all so-called public officials are only private servants of the prince and only there for his own affairs, which is why he appoints them. The genesis and filiation of the innumerable services and places that they all would make the subject of an extremely interesting treatise. Number two, the proof carried out that every person in his circle possesses and exercises the same rights as the prince. There is no one who, like the former, does not give laws about his own affairs, wage war, make peace and alliances, exercise jurisdiction, grant punishments, privileges and favors, etc. Only that the prince exercises them over several and larger objects and possesses more. But the weak cannot always exercise these rights due to lack of property. For example, the poor cannot keep many servants. So it is true that even according to my system and in reality, that princes and beggars have the same rights and the same duties over their own, that all difference consists only in the difference in fortune, and that the master who becomes sovereign through this perfect freedom gains something for himself, but does not receive the slightest new right against his former subordinates. Number three, the merits of the new Roman law terminology and its opposition to the old one, which so precisely indicated the nature of the thing and the basis of the legal relationship. As a Swiss, finally, I believe that I've done my subject a great service by thoroughly rescuing the republics and their principles and putting them on an equal footing with monarchies, while the sophists otherwise either want to turn everything into monarchies or everything into republics. So for Haller, his doctrine, there are several core aspects. One is the doctrine of natural superiority. In fact, one of his essays is literally called "A Law of Nature that the Strong Must Rule." And now a lot of people, when they read that, they're gonna go nuts. Oh, he's advocating the might makes right philosophy of Thrasymachus and Callicles. That's terrible. But it's interesting to note in German, the words Macht and Gewalt, meaning literally power and violence, they do not have the same negative connotation that they do in English. They have a very neutral meaning. And in fact, it was perfectly normal well into the 17th century to use these terms in various charters as a statement of the supreme power of a territorial prince. For example, you'll find in 1470, there's a dictionary of German law called the Deutsches Reichswörterbuch, which gives examples like in 1577, Hoher Landesfürstlicher Macht und Obrigkeit, which literally means high territorial lordly power and authority. Or you also have Königlichen Macht und Gewalt, kingly power and force, literally. These were perfectly normal statements of authority. So the German term Macht is essentially the same as the Roman potestas. It refers to power in the sense of a faculty or a disposition that confers an aptitude to a particular person. This power is an extension of one's own personal rights. And so thus in the proper meaning, when we talk about Macht or the right of the stronger, what we mean is that the weak have a protector, a guardian in the strong. It's a relationship not so much of like chattel slavery, it's a relationship of guardianship and tutelage, which in no way requires that the subject renounce his possessions. In fact, in German tribal law, you have the concept of Mund, like in some of the, I think, charters of Charlemagne, you have the expression in Latin mundiburdium regis, meaning effectively, literally under the hand of the prince, sort of like the king's peace in Anglo-Saxon law. So natural superiority, as Haller says, the first and most general need of men is to live, the second to be protected, the third to be instructed. The poor serves the one who provides him bread, the weak the one who guards him, and not the one who rushes to him with wise sayings. Above all, that power always rules whichever is most needed. Is there a difference between being able and being able to do, between fortune and its use? Far from the fact that everything belongs to the powerful, nothing belongs to him but that what he owns as well as everyone else. Power and superiority are only relative concepts and come in infinite gradations, such that the father commands his children, the master commands his servants, but the president may serve a higher master yet again. The commander rules over his brigade of troops, but he is himself subject to the orders of someone who is recruited and paid for these troops. The master of the house rules over his domestic servants, but the house stands on the ground of someone else. Several people depend on the landowner, but perhaps the landowner himself has received his land from a third party attached with certain obligations and servitudes. Strictly speaking, it is therefore not man who reigns over you, but the power that he has received, the force of nature that he can use for you or against you, but that he should only use for you. And if you examine things in an exact and philosophical way, you will see that God is and remains the one and only master, either as creator or as legislator and regulator of all power distributed among men. And so from that, we now get to the idea of what is sovereignty. And of course, this is one of the most abused words in the English language. I mean, for a long time, I used to hate that word. I still kind of do, actually, with its whole sovereignty is this kind of abstract power of like absolute legislation, or even stupider in the Schmittian sense that a sovereign is he who defines sets the exception, defines the state of exception, which effectively turns the sovereignty into a kind of like it grounds it not on law and regularity, but on irregularity and exception. That's like just completely insane. I don't even know, like all these Schmidt-pilled people, they really, I don't know, it's some kind of it's a good meme, you know, but as an actual idea, it's total. Sovereignty, when Haller talks about sovereignty, he uses it synonymously with the word independence. And the word independence, he also defines as the idea of perfect freedom or perfect liberty, that of being subject to no one but God. Now, this perfect freedom is not some kind of power to legislate or an absolute judicial power or a power of decision or a power of territorial integrity. This kind of independence or sovereignty is an extension of one's own personal freedom. It's a combination of personal power over one's domestic servants in conjunction with the acquired rights and possessions that allow one to demand various rents and services from people who live on the land. So like fundamentally, it's an extension both of a kind of direct power over those who are directly dependent on him, like his crown vassals, his servants, and so forth, as well as those more distant subjects who have a purely proprietary relationship, you know, like he can demand, you know, various like rent, tithes, and so forth. So, as Haller says, sovereignty does not consist of either certain exclusive powers, either isolated or united, for there does not exist any right called sovereignty or majesty which cannot equally be exercised, and which is not often exercised by individuals in a narrow circle, the legitimate exercise of which finds no other obstacles than the lack of opportunity and means. But according to reason as well as to history, sovereignty consists solely in independence, in the good fortune, the highest fortune, in fact, the summa fortuna, to have no human superior above oneself. Independence, which happens always in addition and which consummates the state or the sovereign social relationship, does not change the goal of the private relationship. They are distinguished only from each other as what is large from what is small, of what is perfect from what is not, of what is supported by itself, of what still needs support. It is even to be desired that this expression of civil society, which slipped from the language of the Romans onto ours, is soon banished entirely from science, for just as it was with its consequences, the source of innumerable errors, as was the first to confuse ideas, and imperceptibly lead minds to consider all states, all social relations, as corporations of citizens, or to give them this form, or to at least judge them according to this alleged model. He goes on. We see independence, a better synonym for sovereignty, is a natural consequence of personal power. In fact, I should point out myself that in German, the term sovereignty, Souveränität, doesn't even really enter the lexicon until around the 18th century. The original term in German is Landeshoheit, or in Latin, that would be superioritas territorialis, which literally means like, you know, the one, it's an expression of like highness or aboveness. Like it's an expression that the holder of territorial lordship possesses certain proprietary rights of jurisdiction and exploitation on the given land. Not that he has some kind of like abstract supreme power conferred by a commonwealth, or that like he is the judge of all law, or that he's like somehow exempt from natural law, or that he can just legislate according to his own fancy or whatever. Even in the 15th century, in various French royal charters, for example, you see the term souverain is almost always prefixed with the word seigneur. So like it's always, it means effectively overlord, similar to the German Oberherr. So this is a kind of like a feudal relationship. It's not really anything that we can talk about, like, you know, a rational state, you know, or anything like that. So Haller continues, the landowner therefore reigns naturally and by right over his family, over employees, officers, and servants of all kinds, destined to serve his person, to govern his house, to cultivate his land, to administer his income, etc. Moreover, he reigns over farmers, peasants, and subjects to whom he has granted a part of his land, either for royalties in money or in kind, or for certain specific works. He reigns over vassals and holders of fiefs when he abandoned the enjoyment of such property in exchange for their support and loyalty, on workers and mercenaries, on simple inhabitants who settle in his domains because they find there their means of existence, on temporarily domiciled strangers, etc. All these people with their own retinue, that is to say, with their families and their servants, who may in turn have families and servants of their own, are in various capacities and in various degrees subject to the territorial lord. They depend on him either because they receive the maintenance and amenities of life, either because they're committed to his service by formal pacts, or because they are subordinate to those who have contracted with him, or finally, quite simply, because they inhabit his lands where he is the strongest, the lord, the master, where they need peace and protection and cannot clash with his will without harming themselves. But after all, what is this authority and domination? It is not an absolute and arbitrary right to rule over all things, but only a more elevated existence, a superiority of means to use a legitimate freedom. Based on the personal rights of the master, it is limited by them. Ennobled and tempered by the law of charity, far from stealing freedom from subjects, it is basically only reciprocal assistance and exchange of blessings. And so, from these foundations, there's two kinds of states, monarchies and republics, depending on whether the person with authority is either a natural person or a fictive person, a corporation. And monarchies, in turn, he divides them into three different kinds of exercising power, which correspond to the three estates of the realm and the Indo-European three-class system. So you have those who work, those who fight, and those who preach. And these correspond effectively to the patrimonial state, founded on territorial lordship, the military state, or the empire, which is founded on the personal authority of a military captain to his troops. It's a Personenverband, or you might also say a Männerbund, and the spiritual state founded on the doctrinal authority of a priest or other spiritual doctor. And these are the three kinds of states. And from that point on, he starts summarizing, the various rights of patrimonial princes, the rights and duties of military emperors, how a military empire, by acquiring a fixed settlement, becomes a patrimonial state. He talks about what he calls the macrobiotics of states, i.e., the art of prolonging the life of states. And that is pretty much it, an overview. And all these details, of course, will be up in my commentary. I have a full chapter-by-chapter commentary. It's about, all of it is around it's about 94 chapters or something. There's a lot. It's long. So I'm very thorough about this, and you can read more about it hopefully on Wednesday. I'll try to get it out by then.